How does a broken light bulb, a common household inconvenience, become the psychological trigger for a double murder so visceral, so personal, that it's still shocking today? The answer is buried in the childhood trauma of two sisters and a shared psychological isolation that transformed them from two people into one unstable unit, and in the terrifying final moments when their private world collapsed. Hi, good people. I'm a licensed professional counselor, and this is my mental health analysis of the Papin Sisters. I will be focusing on the main mental health and psychological indicators while providing the backstory. I don't just talk about the crimes, I talk about the psychology behind the crimes and the mysteries that captivate us. I look beyond the facts of the case to understand the why of the crime. My analysis is based on my speculations, not a diagnosis of anyone involved in this case. The key to understanding this case is to first look at the most compelling psychological indicator, profound attachment trauma, and the resulting enmeshment. To comprehend the violence, we must start with the extreme instability of the sisters' early life, which psychologically prepared them for a life of intense, fearful dependency. The sisters, Christine and Leah Papin, were born in a family environment defined by volatility and emotional neglect. Their father, Gustav Papin, was known to be an alcoholic, and the marriage to their mother, Clemmis, was deeply fractured. The family trauma reached a critical point when Christine was just 11. The marriage of Clemmis and Gustav dissolved after allegations of abuse and infidelity involving their older sister. This event shattered the family unit, critically destroyed the foundation of a security a child relies upon. What was perhaps the most damaging psychological blow, their mom chose to place her daughters in a succession of Catholic orphanages and convents. For a child, this is not just a change of address, it's a primal experience of abandonment. The very person who was supposed to be the source of unconditional safety and love has pushed them away, signaling to the child's developing psyche that the world is inherently unsafe and they are unworthy of care. This experience created a profound attachment wound. When you are deprived of a healthy external attachment, you seek it wherever you can find it. And for Christine and Leah, who had been separated and reunited, they found it in each other. They began to construct a shared self-contained universe. This process is called psychological enmeshment. It's a relational pattern where the boundaries between two individuals become so blurred that they effectively function as a single unit. There is no individual autonomy. The needs, fears, and identities of one person are instantly mirrored and absorbed by the other. The older and more dominant sister became the psychological architect of this shared world. Leah became the follower, the quiet mirror. They were psychologically starved, and they tried to feed that infinite hunger with each other, creating a codependent relationship of almost cult-like intensity. This extreme dependency is the first critical piece of evidence that explains the why. Any threat to the shared world would be seen by their unconscious as a threat to their very survival. Their professional life further solidified this dangerous psychological boundary between their us and the terrifying them, which was the outside world. In 1926, the sisters took employment with a Lancian family in Le Mans, serving Rene, a retired solicitor, and his wife Leonie, and their daughter, Genevieve. This job required them to live a life of almost absolute seclusion. They had no friends, no visitors, and seemingly no interest outside of their domestic duties and each other. The isolation was a psychological choice, but it was also a psychological cage. Humans regulate their emotions and test their reality through social interaction. When you are completely cut off, your internal narratives intensify, becoming the only reality. In this vacuum, the demanding nature of Leon Lancian would have been amplified in the sisters' minds. To the traumatized psyche, a demanding employer is not just a difficult boss. She can easily be internalized as a rejecting maternal figure from their childhood. the person who controls their existence and who will ultimately abandon them. Every critique, every reminder of their class status and servitude would have been experienced by Christine and Leah as a fresh trauma, confirming their deepest fears, and the outside world was hostile, critical, and trying to trap them. This sustained closed-loop existence, fueled by years of repressed fear and emotional intensity, allowed a kind of shared psychological reality to take root. This is not necessarily a folie à deux, but it operates on a similar principle. Christine's anxiety and the sense of persecution would have been adopted and internalized by Leah, creating an environment where their fears were constantly validated by the only other person they trusted. How long can two psychologically wounded people survive in a closed environment, perceiving their employers as jailers, before something finally gives way? This is the core psychological mystery that drove this case for years. The sudden catastrophic explosion of violence on February 2nd, 1933 was not caused by a major conflict, but by an event so small, so commonplace, that it speaks volumes about the Papin sisters' fragile mental state. On that day, an electric iron used by Christine malfunctioned, causing a short circuit, blowing the fuse. The house was plugged into darkness. This seemingly minor domestic failure was the ultimate psychological trigger for someone who anchors their entire sense of worth and control in their duties, and whose life in constant fear of the authority that they serve. A broken object and a resulting darkness represent the loss of control and an immediate certainty of impending punishment. This failure would have been perceived not as an accident, but as an existential crisis, proof that they would be reprimanded, and proof that their precarious, isolated life was about to be upended. When Leonie Lanson and her daughter Genevieve returned to their dark house, the confrontation was immediate. Leonie, known for her temper, allegedly confronted the sisters about the darkness and the broken appliance and light bulb. In the fraction of a second, when that confrontation occurred, years of repressed trauma emerged. The fear of the rejecting mother, the terror of abandonment, and the fragile psychological boundary between the sisters all dissolved at the same time. The external world came crashing into their internal toxic refuge. What happened next was an act of extreme disorganized violence, suggesting a complete breakdown of normal psychological barriers and impulse control. Christine grabbed a pewter hammer, and Leah armed herself with a knife. The details of the crime are horrific, and they offer a disturbing window into psychological forces at play. Both Leonie and Genevieve were violently attacked, and the sisters were later convicted of this brutal double murder. The nature of the violence was particularly revealing. The victims were physically assaulted, and their eyes were gouged out. This is not just a random injury. It's a highly symbolic act of psychological retribution. In the sisters' paranoid, trauma-driven reality, the Lancians, especially Leonie, represented surveillance, judgment, and control. The eyes are the instruments of judgment. By destroying the victim's eyes, Christine, the main aggressor, was symbolically blinding the judging authority, eliminating the source of their fear, and taking back control in the most profound and desperate way possible. It was an attempt to make the persecutors stop seeing them, stop judging them. The final act committed by the sisters immediately after the murder is perhaps the most chilling piece of psychological evidence. After the extreme violence, they cleaned themselves, put their bloody clothing aside, and climbed into bed together, huddling under the covers. They refused to speak or respond when René Lanson, the husband, arrived and could not gain entry into the locked room. This behavior signifies a complete psychological regression. Having violently annihilated the external threat, they retreated to the only safe place that they had ever known, their shared, enmeshed sanctuary. They returned to a primal dependent state, confirming that the entire crime was an act of psychological self-preservation for the dyad, not a rational, premeditated murder. This is the ultimate OMG moment in this analysis. The violence was an escape from reality, and the bed was the retreat back into their shared toxic fantasy. The aftermath of their arrest offers the final conclusive proof of the nature of their psychological bond. When police finally gained entry and arrested them, the sisters could not be separated. They clung to each other desperately. Once they were forcibly placed in separate cells, their psychological stability fractured immediately, especially in the case of Christine. Christine, who was the psychological leader, descended into a rapid, terrifying breakdown. Without Leah, her sense of self evaporated. She became catatonic, suffered violent emotional outbursts, and expressed extreme separation anxiety, screaming for her sister. She even attempted to harm herself by tearing out her own eyes, perhaps an echo of the symbolic violence she had perpetrated, now turned inward. Her mental health deteriorated so completely that she was eventually declared insane and transferred to an asylum, where she was diagnosed with a severe form of paranoia and delusional disorder. Christine died in that asylum 4 years later, a victim of her own profound mental health collapse and a refusal to eat, which is a direct consequence of the psychological annihilation that she experienced when separated from her anchor, Leah. Leah Papin, the more submissive personality, followed a different path. Separated from Christine, she appeared more confused and passive, eventually being found to be under the complete psychological influence of her sister during the crime. She was convicted but received a shorter sentence. Leah's trajectory suggests that her core identity was intact enough to survive separation, though heavily influenced by Christine. She was the reflection, but Christine was the source of the light. Once released, Leah was able to assume a new identity and vanish, confirming the central psychological clue. The Papin sisters were a single psychological entity driven by trauma, and the separation ultimately killed the driving force of that entity. The case, therefore, is not a simple story of two criminals. It's a profound, horrifying psychological case study of how two individuals traumatized and abandoned in childhood can build a closed, codependent psychological world that, when finally threatened by the smallest external force, collapses in an act of spectacular personalized violence. It's a sad story about the devastating long-term effects of childhood trauma and betrayal on the adult mind. What did you think about this case? Were there any elements that stood out to you? Let me know. And it's so tragic, isn't it, to learn about these two sisters that had two completely different endings, but yet they shared the similar trauma, and that trauma formed into enmeshment that really turned into violence. If you want more mental health analysis of true crime stories like this one, be sure to subscribe for more. And if you found this case compelling, be sure to watch this next story. It will make you more aware of your surroundings. Thank you for joining me today. Until next time, stay curious, stay safe.